Welcome to our Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Our topic today is the Grizzlies of Yellowstone, a conservation triumph, presented by Aaron Bott. And Aaron has been with us on quite a few presentations. He is our Yellowstone expert, and he has quite a story to tell about himself and about his background and how it is and why it is that he lives in this area. So, Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you tell everyone all about yourself.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and soon you won't be able to see me, but hopefully everyone can see my presentation. I'm really excited to be talking to everyone about the Grizzlies of Yellowstone and the conservation successes that we've seen over the last 40 years. If you've never been to Yellowstone National Park, it's an incredible area, really rich in biodiversity, and it's made all the more special because it has these grizzly bears, our largest carnivore in the lower 48 states. I've got a lot to talk about today. I'm going to fill up to answer some questions. This is a really exciting topic, lots of information, and hopefully we'll move along swiftly. So without any further ado, I'll give you a quick introduction and a bio of myself. 1 second. Looks like my webcam told me that I just closed out.
I turned it off, Aaron. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much. No worries. And that little screen is still on there. I don't know if there we go. Here we go. Sorry about that. So quick introduction about myself. I am fortunate to say that I'm a 7th generation Westerner. My family's been in the American West for the last 7 generations, since the early 1850s, actually. So we settled in around the Yellowstone area well before it was a national park. I specialize in large carnivore management and conservation, and I received my graduate degree studying wolves in Yellowstone National Park. I currently work with the federal and state government as a wildlife biologist. So I work on all types of species, but perhaps one of my greatest pleasures is working with the Yellowstone Wolf Project, where I get to research wolves and other carnivores in the backcountry. I also deal a lot with grizzly bears and work with the Idaho Fish and Game, helping to capture and collar and sometimes translocate grizzly bears. So this is my specialty. This is an area that I love. I'm excited to bring you along with me on this journey. So to talk a little bit about the science of Yellowstone's grizzly population, we first need to introduce our protagonist, and that is Ursus arctos, or the grizzly bear, or the brown bear, depending on where you live. This can be confusing to some people, but grizzly bears are also brown bears. That's just the common name of the animal. And their distribution is whole Arctic, which means that it's in the northern hemisphere all over the world. So we have populations of Ursus arctos, or grizzly bears, in Europe, in Asia, in Italy, in Scandinavia, in the Gobi Desert, actually, there's a small population. And of course in North America, which includes Alaska and Canada, and presently the Northern Rocky Mountains. So all of these animals, wherever you're from and whatever you want to call them, know that they are the same species, Ursus arctos, excuse me. We're going to be talking about the population in the lower 48 states, where they're commonly known as grizzly bears. Just so you're aware, population-wise, grizzly bears are the second most numerous bear species out of 8 different species on the planet. The most numerous is the American black bear. And if you're queuing in from North America, I don't need to introduce those guys. Grizzly bears and black bears, American black bears, actually share a common ancestor, but they split almost 3 million years ago. So there's a lot of differences between these two species, but they are closely related. The lifespan of a grizzly bear is typically 20 to 30 years, so they do live a long time. They can live over 30 years. So a big animal with a long lifespan. And in the Yellowstone ecosystem, their body weight is typically averaging for males around 400 pounds and for females around 260 pounds. We do have animals larger than that. The largest known grizzly bear in the Yellowstone ecosystem right now is tipping the scales over over 700 pounds. There's a lot of fluctuation in a bear's weight depending on what time of year it is, whether they're coming out of their dens in the spring or whether they're putting on fat to go into their dens in the late fall. But compared to some of the coastal grizzly bears that you'll see up in Alaska or in British Columbia, they're a little bit smaller, and that's because of their diet. They don't have as many rich calories available to them in the form of salmon, for example. So grizzly bears are omnivores, just like us. They eat a little bit of everything. And each population or each region of grizzly bears throughout the world kind of has a different ratio of how many plants versus how much meat they eat. Yellowstone is rich in biodiversity. It's got a lot of ungulates. It's got a lot of hooved animals. That's what an ungulate is. And a lot of these animals can die in the winter, or the young can be vulnerable for hunting grizzly bears. And so because there's such a rich biodiversity in the Yellowstone ecosystem, the grizzly bears there typically eat a little bit more meat than they do in some other populations. So about 60% of their diet is plants, 40% is meat. Now, this next little bit, the reproductive cycle of a grizzly bear, is really important for us to talk about, because this explains why it's been difficult to help this species recover. So in ecology, we have what's called a K versus R selection theory. And basically, to put that in a nutshell, that means that some species reproduce really quickly, like, for example, types of fish, trout, that lay lots of eggs, or amphibians, versus other species that don't reproduce that quickly, and then they take a lot of time rearing their young until they're able to fend for themselves. So humans are like grizzly bears. We put a lot of effort into raising our young, and it takes us a while to become sexually mature. So for a female grizzly bear, she typically isn't capable of reproducing until she's 4 to 5 years old. So she's generally over 5 years old before she gives birth to her first litter of cubs. And the litter size on average is 2 cubs for every year that she gives birth. You can have more and you can have less. Sometimes you'll see 3, just like in this picture, but typically it's 2. Mortality for young, no matter what species of wildlife, the mortality for young is pretty high, generally 50%. And so the mother will take care of her cubs for 2.5 years is the average, but sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's 3 years or even 4 years. And so on average, you have a reproductive cycle of 3 years. And that means this population takes a long time to rebound when the population numbers have been oppressed to a point that they become threatened or endangered. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background about some of their biology. Just so you're aware, they're one of the youngest, evolutionarily speaking, bears, the polar bear being the youngest. Grizzly bears migrated from Eurasia to North America approximately 50 to 70,000 years ago. And historically, we had probably 50,000 grizzly bears living in the contiguous US, so that's the lower 48 states. And today we're looking at approximately 2,000, which is, from what we were at 4 decades ago, is quite a rebound. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but you can see that their historic range was all across the western states. Maybe you live in some areas that used to have grizzly bear habitat, but you were unaware of it. But this animal is a generalist. It lives in a variety of different habitats, and it thrives. So don't think of them just as a mountain animal. They did live all through the deserts of the Southwest and into Mexico. Now, large carnivores, which is what I emphasize my studies in, is a subject that it generates a lot of emotion and a lot of passion. And I really like this quote. Despite being biological entities, large carnivores are almost entirely represented as symbols and emotions. We respond not so much to the carnivores themselves as to our own ideas of these creatures, encapsulated in evocative narratives. And if you take a step back for a second and you look at your own idea of a grizzly bear or a wolf or a cougar, you can perhaps objectively recognize that your own thought process or values of these animals generate from narratives and stories, from the culture you were brought up in. And that's important for us to realize, because large carnivores are big. They kill animals and other things to make a living. And a lot of times throughout history, we've conflicted with them. This is not just an American Western story. Humans throughout all time and throughout all cultures, and no matter what their background was, have had conflicts with these large carnivores. This is a painting of a grizzly bear hunt observed by George Catlin and painted by George Catlin in the 1800s. So it doesn't really matter what your background is. I think it's just honest to recognize that carnivores sometimes conflict with people. However, what is relatively new is the technology that humanity has developed in the last 200 years. The technology of, for example, repeating firearms, which gave us a tremendous advantage over large carnivores. As Euro-Americans began to move westward, our agrarian types of communities conflicted with large predators such as wolves and cougars and grizzly bears. And we became more organized as a nation in routing out these problems that in some cases did cause local economic disruptions. And with the advent of poisons and the repeating rifle, you could probably say that that is what undid the grizzly bear. It definitely undid the wolf through a lot of its historic range, and the cougar as well. So grizzly bears bumping into people eventually resulted in a tremendous demise of their historic population, and that was such a tragedy. Now, not all the grizzly bears throughout the American West were killed off, although reflecting back to that previous map that I showed you, you can see that they have lost about 98% of their historic range in the lower 48 states. California, which has a grizzly bear on its flag, lost its last grizzly bear in 1924. Utah lost theirs in 1923. However, grizzly bears in the northern Rockies, and we're talking about Yellowstone's ecosystem all the way up into the northern continental divide ecosystem, did retain suitable habitat for bears, and more importantly, they had national parks. Yellowstone National Park was first created in 1872, but hunting actually was allowed in the park for a couple of decades until finally we passed some laws that restricted hunting to outside of the park only, and we had authorities in the park that then protected and preserved most wildlife species. Now, before I talk a little bit more about the history of grizzly bear management in Yellowstone, I want everyone to think about what they know about Yellowstone National Park or the national park system and crumple it up and throw it away. Yellowstone National Park, as I said, was the first national park, 1872. But the national park system wasn't established, the service wasn't established until 1916. And even then, the management ideals of the National Park Service back at the turn of the century were very different than what we would recognize today. So here you actually have a picture of Horace Albright, who was one of the first superintendents of Yellowstone National Park, with black bears. These aren't grizzly bears, they're black bears. And he really promoted a system of conservation, but he focused on entertainment. The national parks in the early 1900s were a place for people to go out and to explore and recreate, and they were built for amusement. Wildlife management was so different back then. Feeding the bears next to the road was acceptable. People were expected to hand bears, begging bears food from their campsites. And the National Park Service at the time encouraged that. Something that is so bizarre and seemingly so stupid to us now, but it was the norm back then, and that's what people thought was good. And because of the personality that bears had, because they were amusing, because they were entertaining, frankly, that's what saved them from annihilation in the lower 48 states. Other predators like wolves and cougars were exterminated in Yellowstone National Park by the National Park Service. They hunted them and they trapped them, and they focused on eliminating them from the park because they were considered a threat to elk and to bison, deer, and other charismatic megafauna. But bears were kind of awkward. They remind us of ourselves up on their two legs, and they're kind of cute. And so the Park Service decided that they would protect the bears. And thanks to that, the population basically was able to survive in the national park, Yellowstone, as well as Glacier National Park, but not really anywhere else, because again, bears often, as large carnivores, came into conflicts with human, causing depredation, problems, and property damage. Now, most black bears were coming up to roads and were participating in handout entertainment shows that I showed you in those previous two slides. But grizzly bears, again, are a completely different animal than a black bear. They are larger, and they have evolved in areas where, evolutionarily speaking, they've adapted to behave differently than black bears. So grizzly bears were less commonly seen at handouts or coming up next to cars in the early national park days. However, the National Park Service did generate a lot of trash and garbage from the hotel services and the restaurants that were in the park. And back in the day, they would simply take all of this waste and they would dump it in the national park in designated dump sites. And grizzly bears from the backcountry would come to these dump sites where they would feed on this artificially caloric rich feast. And grizzly bears were able to actually reach artificially high numbers in Yellowstone National Park because they didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to compete with one another for food resources. They didn't have to go out and forage. There was always a ready supply of fats and calories and proteins and sugars that they could get from leftover human waste. And the National Park Service encouraged this. Now, we look at that and we think, man, how stupid. That is not a very healthy way the ecosystem should be operating. But again, remember, the Park Service was young. The term ecology, the science of ecology, didn't even really pick up until the 1930s. And it actually wasn't until these two gentlemen, my personal heroes, John and Frank Craighead, began pioneering grizzly bear research in Yellowstone that we really began to understand how the biology and the ecology of these animals work. So hitherto, the Craigheads' research, nothing was really known about large carnivore ecology and behavior, especially not of grizzly bears. And the Craigheads actually were the ones that invented radio telemetry or radio collars so that we can begin to study animal movements. And you can see them fitting one of the early prototypes on this grizzly bear here. And because of this, we began to understand that animals actually need more than just a postage stamp of land in order to be conserved. I know it sounds crazy, but prior to the 1960s, we didn't know, or we didn't understand or appreciate that wildlife migrates and needs resources beyond a national park's boundaries. But once we started radio collaring animals, we started to to realize that these animals rely on an entire ecosystem, not just a designated national park. Well, partially in response to 2 tragic human fatalities in Glacier National Park in 1967, where grizzly bears, 2 different grizzly bears, coincidentally attacked 2 women in 2 different locations of Glacier National Park on the same night and killed them. The National Park Service had a very rude wake-up call. I want to say this right now that I love grizzly bears and I think they're fantastic, but they are highly dangerous. In fact, they're perhaps the most dangerous carnivore that we have in North America. Wolves perhaps being the least dangerous to humans, but bears are innately curious. They're like huge 600-pound, 500-pound toddlers, and they can cause a lot of damage. And eventually, as we learned, the food conditioning at the garbage dumps spoiled bears into behaving perhaps in an unnatural way. And tragically, human lives were lost again on the same night. And so Yellowstone and the National Park Service immediately began to rectify their mismanagement of bears by shutting down garbage dumps. Particularly, they wanted to have what they called a natural condition of Park Service by 1972, which was the centennial anniversary of Yellowstone. So they rapidly began closing all dumps and locking up all food storage. Now, I know this seems like a really good idea, and it is, but as the Craigheads openly disagreed and explained, you have had generations of grizzly bears feeding artificially, or excuse me, at artificial feeding sites, these huge dumps, and bears are smart and they're generational learners, and suddenly taking away that predictable resource of calories caused a lot of problems. The Craigheads disagreed with the Park Service's management of sudden dump closure. They agreed that the dump should be closed, but they argued that it should be done moderately over time, over a 10-year period. But this led to a huge controversy, a lot of internal strife and debate between independent scientists, the Craigheads, and their allies and research constituents, as well as the National Park Service. And ultimately, the Park Service decided to close all of the dumps quickly. And tragically, as I mentioned, these food-conditioned bears, they caused a lot of problems. These animals suddenly started looking for other food sources from humans, and they caused a lot of property damage. In some cases, they killed a person or injured people, and they began to look to livestock for food, and they began to threaten people. And in all of these cases, the grizzly bears paid the cost. And tragically, in a 4-year period, 156 grizzly bears were killed in Yellowstone. You have to remember that outside of the park, we really didn't have a grizzly bear population. So to wipe out potentially half or more than half of the existing grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem in a 4-year period was tragic. And all of this generated a lot of controversy. If you were aware of this back in the 1970s, it was hitting national news. Suddenly, the grizzly bear population has been halved. Conflicts between researchers and Park Service personnel really got hot and heated. National Geographic got involved and began to pick sides. And ultimately, a committee from the National Academy of Sciences recognized that the grizzly situation needed to be fixed. And so they stepped in and they did an independent analysis of the grizzly population and recommended to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that the grizzly bear be protected. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act had been created, and in 1975, the grizzly bear was listed as a threatened species in the lower 48 states. Not an endangered species because populations elsewhere in the world were relatively stable. In fact, today, grizzly bears are doing really well in Alaska and British Columbia, the Northwest Territories. Grizzly populations are doing very well. But here in the lower 48 states, they were listed as a threatened species. To fix this, again, the government decided to initiate interagency programs that would monitor grizzly bear research and grizzly bear populations and management. This was the most brilliant move that anyone could have hoped for. So the interagency grizzly bear study team, led by the U.S. Geological Society, working with multiple other agencies, tribal agencies, Park Service, Forest Service, and state wildlife agencies, all got together to work on monitoring and helping recover grizzly bear populations in the Yellowstone ecosystem. I want to take a side note here and just say that if you're unfamiliar with how wildlife management works in the United States, you need to understand this. Under the 10th Amendment, all wildlife management falls under the jurisdiction of each state. So if you're in Washington State, for example, your state is in charge of monitoring and managing its elk populations and its black bear populations, etc. This only changes if a species is determined to be imperiled or on the point of endangerment or threatened of becoming endangered, at which time the federal government will step in and it will manage a species until the species is declared viable and recovered, at which time the species management goes back to the states. So for the U.S. Geological Society, or USGS, to be working closely with states and other wildlife agencies to help preserve a grizzly bear population, that was revolutionary, and it brought all stakeholders to the table. Also, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, which is a management team, was created in order to receive the scientific recommendations of the interagency study team. So the Grizzly study team is an unbiased cooperation of scientists managing and researching grizzlies, and they provide information and advice for the interagency committee, which then chooses how and decides how it will manage the population. It's really important to the story for you to understand that, so hopefully I didn't lose anyone, but ultimately 6 habitat zones were designated for grizzly bear recovery. Hitherto we've been talking about Yellowstone grizzlies, but recognize that the Yellowstone ecosystem is much larger than the national park. Just like the Craigheads found out when they were using radio collars on animals. Bears move, elk move, moose move beyond national park boundaries. And so you can see in the bottom right-hand side of my map, there's the Yellowstone ecosystem. That's a grizzly bear protected zone. You also have 5 other zones that were protected for grizzly bear recovery. The next largest viable population is the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. That includes Glacier National Park up in northern Montana. Then you have the Selkirk, the Cabinet Yaak, the Northern Cascades, and the Bitterroot recovery zones as well. To date, some of these other recovery zones have very small grizzly bear populations. In fact, the 2 that are doing, or the 3 I should say, that are doing the best is the Yellowstone population, the Northern Continental Divide population, and the Cabinet Yaak. The Northern Cascades, even though that's a large area on the map, probably has less than 10 grizzly bears, and we're still working to recover that population. The Bitterroot there in central Idaho actually does not have any grizzly bears. However, that land has been set aside for grizzly bear recovery, and in the next few decades, or however long it takes, we'll hopefully see some viable recovery there. So here we go again. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem incorporates an area much larger than actually this map shows, but also the national park covers. This yellow line that goes around that postage stamp, which is Yellowstone National Park, is the designated grizzly bear recovery area, just a part of the ecosystem actually. So it's parts of Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, as well as Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park. So here we go. We've set the stage for grizzly conservation. We did something right by establishing a system of scientists, unbiased scientists from multiple agencies collaborating, researching these animals, and then giving the data that they collect to a committee of interagency managers. So we've got the system, we've got the foundation. What was done differently? Well, first and foremost, we did not open up dumps. That was a mistake to begin with, and rather than pedaling backwards, we began to push for the motto that a fed bear is a dead bear. We began to take extra precautions to keep bears away from being food conditioned to human foods. Bears, as I said, they're troublesome. I love bears, but unlike a wolf and unlike a cougar, grizzlies seek opportunities to make life easier for them. That stereotype is pretty accurate, which you see in some movies like The Jungle Book, where the bear Baloo wants to have an easy life. Bears, they have to eat a lot in order to live, in order to survive the long winters where they den. And in order to do that, it's easier to eat a Twinkie and get a caloric burst than it is to eat a bunch of grass and try and consume just as many calories that way. So people began to be required to store their food properly. This picture on the bottom shows the Yellowstone Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center area, where we have bears that test out products to make sure that they're approved by the Grizzly Committee so that bears can't get in them. We have designated trash cans that prevent bears from getting into food. Backpackers use canisters like you see at the top of this image, where they store their food, where they hang it in trees according to certain regulations. Anything that we can do to keep bears from becoming food conditioned or habituated to human food will prevent conflicts in the future and will keep bears alive. Another huge thing that we began doing is we started closing off roads to wilderness areas. If you're interested in wolves, you can watch my other webinar where I talk about how wolves, even though they're a symbol of wilderness, they're actually very capable of surviving in areas that are not wilderness, such as highly dense human concentrated cities in Europe. We have wolf populations there. Grizzly bears are different though. Wolves can go unnoticed, but if you have a grizzly bear in someone's downtown park, everyone's going to notice, and that bear could get into trouble. And so to preserve as much grizzly bear habitat as possible, we began shutting down roads. We closed access to where people can go in certain areas and at certain times where we know grizzlies are going to be. And we began to utilize this bear spray. And a lot of people who come out west, they ask me questions about bear spray. Is it real? Does it really work? Or is it a hoax? Yes, it works. Bear bells, on the other hand, don't really work. But bear spray actually does work. It's a highly concentrated pepper spray, and it shoots up to 35, 40 feet. Works very well, and it basically gets a curious bear away from you without humans having to negatively tango with that bear, get run over or get scratched by that bear. We also had a big push to educate the public, and we had movie stars and other popular folks, whether they be recreational athletes or politicians, come out and talk about how it's best to coexist with bears. So we began to do a lot of outreach, and that really helped inform people about how to coexist with bears. And that was the biggest thing that we could have done in order to protect these remaining animals. Of course, in the 1990s, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park. Cougars, which a lot of people don't realize had been annihilated from Yellowstone, they actually began to recolonize the national park all on their own. And we now have a healthy population of cougars. The wolf population has come back into the park and the surrounding environment. This is a great picture taken by my supervisor with Yellowstone, Dan Staler, photographed from a plane in the air, where you can see wolves that made a kill. I'm not sure if that was a bison or an elk. The wolves do a lot of the dirty work, and the bears are bullies, and they kind of push the wolves off of the kill. Wolves and bears, they pretty much avoid each other as much as they can. Bears are bullies and wolves are are leaner and faster and better at bringing down prey. Cougars do the same thing. They're more efficient hunters than even wolves. And so by having these other two large carnivores on the landscape, help to provide carcasses made by the hardworking wolves and cougars that later the grizzly bears could usurp. They could steal them from these other animals, and that helped benefit the grizzly bear population. So what have we seen now in the last 40 years since the grizzly bear has been listed as a threatened species? Well, one of the biggest concerns we had was that the grizzly population in the Yellowstone ecosystem, which probably was around 200, people like to go even lower and say in about 130 or so, but most likely around 200 animals living in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Will they be genetically sustainable over a long period of time, or will such a small population result in dramatic inbreeding? That was a huge concern that we had. So over the last 40 years, we've been taking samples of these animals, testing them, and as the grizzly bear population has multiplied, I mean, in a huge way, exponentially before it hit a social carrying capacity in the 2000s, we have recognized that the grizzly bear population actually is sustainable in terms of genetic variability. Over the last 25 years, we've only seen a 0.2% ratio of inbreeding through genetic sampling of these animals. And so having seen that and having seen an increased fourfold population number of reproductive animals in this ecosystem, long-term genetic viability is not a concern that we have. In fact, much to the relief of everyone, it looks like all of these animals have reached the point where they will be capable of maintaining genetic viability for decades to come. So in 2019, the estimated population size derived from multiple modeling and data analysis have estimated that there is 737 grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, people want to know exactly how many bears we have in the ecosystem, and this is a really difficult question to answer, and it frustrates the public because it involves a lot of math and a lot of science. We can say with 95% confidence that 737 animals as of 2019 in the Yellowstone ecosystem is on a very conservative scale for the number or the abundance and demographic of grizzlies across the entire ecosystem. In fact, the closer we get to looking at and analyzing better methods of modeling, we can see that there's probably closer to 1,000 grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. But conservatively, we like to point out that there's at least 737 animals, and we do this by aerial monitoring and capture and recapture analysis of females and reproductive cycles, and females with cubs particularly. And it's been a huge success. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service originally said that 500 was the benchmark for delisting. As soon as we had 500 grizzly bears and an assurance of genetic variability in the population, that this animal could be delisted. And we've definitely gone above that. Again, being conservative, we're looking at the mid 700s, but more likely it's probably in the 1,000 or in the 900 to 1,000 range. Now, we have to talk a little bit about the politics or the biopolitics of grizzly bear management. We've definitely had a huge success story with the grizzly bears recovering. We went from the mismanagement and misunderstanding of grizzly bears in the early 1900s to suddenly a foundation of hard data and science and understanding how we can preserve these bears, protecting their habitat, and protecting humans from interacting or negatively interacting with bears has definitely helped this population recover. And it's taken 4 decades, but we've gone from 200 bears to 800 bears at a minimum, a 4-fold increase. And we're extremely excited to have this be such a a champion in the forefront of wildlife conservation. But it is important to recognize that grizzly bears were listed in distinct population segments as threatened species. The next nearest population of viable grizzlies is in the northern continental divide. You can see it here in this map with Glacier National Park being there along the Canadian border. That's a lot of land in between these two distinct population segments. One of the bigger concerns, which I already addressed, is that there's not any genetic sustainability for the Yellowstone ecosystem being so isolated. The Northern Continental Divide ecosystem borders Canada, goes up through British Columbia and Alberta directly above it. And there's a lot of coming and going of other grizzly bears and grizzly populations to ensure genetic variability there. But as I've already addressed, our concerns for genetic variability in the Yellowstone ecosystem are very much assuaged, and we're not worried about grizzly bears interbreeding in Yellowstone. This brings us perhaps to a more realistic concern that isn't talked about as much, but grizzly bears need landscape. And while we desire the connectivity between the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem and the Yellowstone ecosystem, the reality is that in order to bridge those two populations, we need to work more on land management. It's not the hunting, although it's a very controversial and I understand an emotionally driven debate. It's not necessarily the hunting, and it's not the anti-bear attitudes that are impacting the population of grizzly bears as we currently are monitoring them. It's the loss of habitat, and primarily that comes from people like you and me who love these animals and want to live closer to them, buying up prime bear and elk and deer and wolf habitat and turning it into subdivisions. And our cities around and our towns around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are growing faster than anywhere else in the United States at present. And as more and more habitat is lost, it really regulates the amount of bears that we can have on the landscape. Understanding that 80% of all documented grizzly bear mortalities are human caused, meaning that grizzly bears coming into developed human areas cause threats. They threaten people, they threaten livestock, they get into trouble, they get hit by cars, and most of the time this ends up with the bear being dead. Again, grizzly bears, they need wilderness. I want to go back 1 second to this map again, just to show you as the bear density radiates out of Yellowstone National Park or the recovery zone around it, the likelihood of bear survival decreases. And the reason why is because you can see the bears come into Bozeman, they come into Cody, they go into Dillon, they go into Idaho Falls. They go into areas where perhaps it's not possible for us to coexist with grizzly bears. There's a reason why grizzly bears haven't been reintroduced into Los Angeles or San Francisco or Salt Lake City. Populations of humans and grizzly bears just don't tango very well. They don't dance too well together. So protecting habitat is the #1 concern that we have for grizzly bear conservation in the future. Really quick, just so you're aware, the grizzly bear population did meet the minimum requirements for delisting in 2007. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service declared that the Yellowstone grizzly bear population should be removed from the endangered species protections. However, at the time, there was ongoing concern about the viability of whitebark pine trees in the Yellowstone ecosystem, which provide a rich abundance of calories in the form of pine nuts to this species. Whitebark pine trees are being impacted by climate change, also by an invasive fungus which is killing them. And so in 2009, grizzly bears were relisted in the Yellowstone area. Again, I'm only talking about the Yellowstone population. Grizzly bears were relisted while ongoing research analyzed if climate change and a decrease in whitebark pine trees would impact the grizzly population. After an intensive analysis, grizzly bears and whitebark pine trees have been determined that there isn't a strong enough link for us to be concerned about grizzly bears. And I know that climate change, and this is obviously on everyone's mind, climate change is destroying wildlife habitat and wildlife all over the planet. However, for a grizzly bear, which is a generalist and an omnivore, climate change is not going to impact grizzly bears as much as it is going to impact their cousin, the polar bear, for example, or other species that are highly sensitive to climatic changes. Remember, there are grizzly bears in the Gobi Desert. There are grizzly bears were grizzly bears in Mexico. Grizzly bears can eat just about anything, and they're very adaptable. So since we've kind of assuaged some of those concerns, the grizzly bear again was up for delisting in the Yellowstone population in 2017. Again, having exceeded the minimum recovery requirements, as well as proving that there's a genetic variability which is sustainable in that population. But in 2018, the federal protections were again reinstated. This time it had more to do with political moves rather than scientific moves. Is it practical and is it politically correct for us to have distinct population segments of grizzly bears, or should they all be grouped together as one population? Should we be able to delist the Yellowstone grizzly bear before we delist the Northern Continental Divide population of grizzly bears? Those are the questions that are currently being fought over. And I think the politics are interesting, but I'm just trying to explain the situation so that you can understand where the grizzly bear management is currently at. Again, on the upside, grizzly bears have been multiplying as much as fourfold in the Yellowstone ecosystem, even as much as fivefold. This here shows that the Yellowstone grizzly population recovery zone, and the boundary lines radiating outside of that are where grizzly bears are currently occupying the Yellowstone ecosystem. So grizzly bear habitat occupancy has increased by 48% beyond the recovery zone. And the ongoing population monitoring shows that right now the grizzly population is at social carrying capacity. So if we're at 700 to 800 grizzly bears in this population, we can't really expect to get much higher than that. The reason why is because the more bears you have in the landscape, the more they're going to compete with each other, and the more cub mortality you'll see. The more mortality you'll see among bears fighting for the same resources. And so it's kind of at a social carrying capacity right now, and it's been stable since the mid 2000s. So currently, this is what we've got. This is the recovery of the grizzly, and it's been fantastic. It's been phenomenal. This is my last slide that I have to share with you, but the grizzly bear it's highly intelligent, and it's an opportunistic animal. It's capable of adapting to environmental challenges and changes. And I think that because of its adaptability, we've had biology on our side while studying and helping this animal recover. But just like the grizzly bear's earlier conflicts in the 1800s and early 1900s, their survival depends on human tolerance and the preservation of habitat. That's what I want to drive home. Again, I know that people have ethical issues with hunting grizzly bears. Understand that even if the grizzly bear population were to be delisted from the endangered species protections, the interagency grizzly bear study team is bound to continually research and collect data on this population to make sure that it does not regress and contract in reproductive numbers and in genetic variability. So the science is there to stay. Right now, what can we do to help preserve this animal? It's all about helping stop habitat fragmentation. There's not a lot of wilderness left in the lower 48 states where grizzly bears can live. You've seen this picture back here. Yellowstone is 2.2 million acres. Right now, the grizzlies are ranging in probably 17 million acres, and yet we've reached a carrying capacity of 700 to 800 grizzly bears. That's a lot of land, and yet that's how many grizzly bears can naturally fit on that landscape. Where else in the West do we have that much wilderness where grizzlies can thrive? Sadly and tragically, it's those areas that still do exist are quickly diminishing in size. So hopefully that was a little bit of an introduction to perk your interests, to answer some of your questions. Grizzly bears, again, as all large carnivores are, they're fascinating. They invoke a lot of emotion and a lot of discussion. But I think the biggest thing to take away from this is we have been successful as a nation in helping recover a population that was on the very brink of extinction. And no matter what the current politics or legislation or status of these individuals are, I think we can all pat ourselves on the back and think about, wow, this is incredible. We've got genetic variability, sustainability, and this population's doing really well. So that's it.
Aaron, thank you so much. I'm going to give you control to turn your webcam back on there, and we will get into some questions. And our first question here is from Valerie. She was on our 2017 Southwest Canyons trip. She's curious to know how many grizzlies are currently in the Yellowstone ecosystem.
So going back to give you the answer that I shared earlier, currently the 2019 estimate was 737, if I got that right. That is a conservative estimate, and we anticipate there being more than that. It's a conservative estimate because most of that data is processed and analyzed through observation. And so we have researchers all over in the field documenting grizzly bear sightings, as well as the reproductive status of females. And so I would say that 700 is a minimum, and probably as many as 1,000.
And are they expanding their range eastward towards the Bighorns or in any other direction outside of Yellowstone?
Yes, they are. I'm going to go back two slides. You can see that the radiating line on the boundary of my image here, that black line with diagonal stripes through it, that is where grizzlies have been expanding even beyond current documentation. And so we get reports occasionally in the Bighorns and in other areas where grizzlies are moving eastward and are bumping into humans. Bears like to raid farm pastures as well as livestock areas. So they're happy if they end up in a cornfield or a wheat field. And yes, grizzly bears are expanding eastward, but in doing so, they're coming into more human habitat, and so there's more conflicts.
How many have been collared for research?
Oh, that's a really good question. I can't give you an exact number off the top of my head. I know that there's two answers to that question. Historically, how many total have been collared? I would guess it's in the high hundreds, perhaps even 1,000 have been collared since they were first being researched in the late 50s. At present, how many are collared in Yellowstone's ecosystem? Again, I don't know off the top of my head. I would guess that it's in the hundreds, though.
Okay, thank you. And a couple of questions about, let's see, this one. The comment that grizzlies have a small hump on their back. Is that for fat storage?
Good question. It's actually a muscle. So it's a muscle up on the scapula that grizzly bears evolved with, because grizzly bears, unlike black bears, generally live out on the open tundra or plains where they dig. Grizzly bears have those enormous claws. They're about 3 inches on average. And those claws are not for eviscerating tourists, as most people think. They're actually for digging. So think of them as badger claws. So they dig up roots and tubers, and in order to do all that digging, they've evolved with a very large muscle on their shoulders. Again, a muscle to help them dig.
Okay. Well, how fast can they run?
Another good question. Grizzly bears can run up to 35 miles an hour. So that's a lot faster than the fastest human. So don't ever try and outrun a bear, whether it's a grizzly bear or a black bear or a polar bear. Don't try and outrun a bear. It'll catch you just like a dog will. But there's more action if the bear catches you, I promise.
Yes, no doubt. Okay, gestation period. What is the gestation period?
This is super cool. I'm glad someone asked that. So grizzly bears and black bears and a number of other animals in the animal kingdom have what's known as delayed implantation. So it's not like humans and it's not like elk and deer. What happens is, and I'll try and make this as simple as possible, grizzly bears typically breed in June or the 1st of July. And after that, the females and the males go their separate ways and they have to put on as much weight as they can before winter comes. So they eat and they eat and they eat as much as 20,000 calories a day in order to build up thick fat reserves. During this time, the female, her reproductive cycle has not yet technically impregnated her. So the embryo is floating within the uterus but is not attached to the uterine wall. So the bear does not actually become pregnant until she goes into hibernation, usually in November. And 2 months later, about 8 weeks later, she'll give birth. So it's a complicated question. How long is the gestation? Well, technically they mate in July and then they give birth usually in January or February. So that would be almost 8 months, 7 months. However, their bodies aren't like our bodies, and she does not actually become pregnant until she goes into hibernation, at which time the blastocyst will attach to the uterine wall, and she will then help fertilize that for the next 8 weeks and give birth to cubs that are 1 pound. 1 pound.
1 pound. That is so tiny. I guess they probably grow put on weight rather quickly.
Yes, a grizzly bear's milk is really rich in fat and protein, way more than a cow's. And so when the bear comes out, it's been born in January, and then usually mom will come out of her den at the end of April, right about now, actually. The cubs are usually about 20, sometimes even 30 pounds. So a lot of weight really quick.
Yeah, wow. So we have someone asking where the name grizzly comes from. Why do we call them that?
Good question. So grizzly bears got that nickname because of their long guard hairs. So grizzly bears have long hairs all over their back that often look silvery, kind of hoary is the word for it. They look aged and grizzled. And so early trappers and explorers, particularly the French, would look at the bear and they'd refer to them as grizzly bears. Elsewhere throughout Europe and throughout Asia, they just call them brown bears. And up in Canada and all through Alaska, you'll often hear them referred to as brown bears. But the people down here in the lower 48 states, we thought they looked grizzled, and so we call them grizzly bears.
All right. My last question for you. How long have grizzly bears been in Yellowstone?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. We know, and a lot of biologists, I should say this, we know that they've been there for probably about 50,000 years. I told you that grizzly bears evolutionarily are one of the youngest bear species. Polar bears are the youngest. They actually evolved from grizzly bears. And grizzly bears evolved in Eurasia and came across the Bering Land Bridge during the Pleistocene. And some paleobiologists believe that the grizzly bear population was actually extending eastward and eventually had humans never, or Euro-Americans, I should say, never arrived on the Atlantic shore, perhaps they would have eventually made it all the way out to the eastern states. But for tens of thousands of years, they've been in the Yellowstone area.
Okay, thank you. This has been so neat. Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to educate us today. I am going to stop with the questions now and turn it back to you for final thoughts.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone tuning in. Again, carnivores are fascinating. They're emotive. They generate a lot of thought and passion and feelings of animosity and love. I think that biologically they're an incredible species. I hope that in this complicated story of management and policies and science, you have taken away at least the most important thing, which is that conservation has been successful. We've seen a lot of good things in the Yellowstone ecosystem because we decided to work together, because we applied real science to good management. And in doing so, the grizzly bear population it's recovered. So we're excited about that, and hopefully some of you who have never been to the Yellowstone area will someday be able to come out and appreciate these animals which you helped conserve.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for being with us. It was great. This is a great way to end the week. We'll start with more of our daily dose of nature on Monday. And so look for the email invitation over the weekend. But I will tell you that our first topic on Monday is going to be about rhinos. So we hope you'll come and learn about rhinos. And with that, we'll say good day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks again, Aaron.